Here. Okay, well, we're starting things off. So thank you so much, everyone, for attending this very special webinar on communicating sustainability. It's about crafting transparent, compliant messaging for a competitive edge. And I'm very glad to welcome two experts in the space who are going to be presenting here at the Screen Story webinar. Uh, start off with is Dr. Alana James. She's the Associate Professor in Fashion in the School of Design at Northumbria University. She's an expert in the use of design tools, methods, and approaches to create sustainable innovation in the global fashion value chain. She creates impact with this research through international publications, presentations, and doctoral examination. She is very much an interdisciplinary expert and has worked with a breadth of stakeholders across the fashion and textile industry. And together, they're looking at very complex, wicked problems when it comes to social and environmental challenges. And all of this really culminates in her experience and her role as the director of the Impact Plus network, for which full disclosure, Green Story is also a part. And her priorities and her expertise is to really bridge that disciplinary knowledge and to develop integral relationships with project partners which are inclusive and transparent. So welcome, Ilana. And we also have Professor Anne Peirson-Smith joining us. She is the subject lead and the professor for fashion in the School of Design at Northumbria University. A very experienced academic, a researcher, and a research project manager who has a breadth of background in the creative industry. She's secured a range of industry-oriented research projects focusing on communication and, very interestingly, marketing sustainability and circularity in the fashion industry. Relatively new topic, so this is somebody who's had a lot of expertise before it became a thing. And she also works a lot on clothing longevity and durability and multi-stakeholder initiatives. Recent research that she's worked on includes the marketing discourse and promotional strategies for sustainable fashion brands from 2015 to 2020. It's something, of course, that a lot of people here attending might know of because of new legislation that's come across the EU and the UK. And in addition to all of this, she's regularly contributed to industry panels including ASBCI, and has been involved in a number of recent consultations with the global denim industry, with workwear, leading online retailers, upcyclers, and sustainability NGOs. So we have between them two of the leading experts in the space on sustainable communication globally. So I'm very excited to welcome this, and I'll pass it on to Anne and Alana.
Okay, thank you so much, Akhil. And I'm going to offer a warm welcome to all of our attendees today at the webinar, which is running in collaboration with Green Story and working with Akhil, focusing on communication sustainability. As you can see here, we're looking at crafting transparent, compliant messaging for a competitive edge. And we're going to address how using communications strategically to implement sustainable and circular solutions is a big opportunity for all organizations and brands to basically implement a transformed industry landscape based on highlighting and storytelling and sort of framing the ways that sustainable and circular solutions can be implemented across the value and supply chain. And now I'm going to hand over to my colleague to introduce herself. Alana, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Anne. I don't think there's too much more that Anne and I can say about ourselves that Akhil hasn't covered. So I think you know who we are by now, but just to quickly reiterate a couple of points. So Anne and I are both at Northumbria University in Newcastle upon Tyne in the UK. We both sit within the fashion department, and we fundamentally work together as PI and COI for the Impact Plus network. So this is a large scale funded project by the UKRI in the United Kingdom, the research councils across the Natural Environment Research Council, the Arts and Humanities Research Council, and Innovate UK. And our primary purpose is to challenge the way that environmental impact is measured, analysed and assessed. So basically how we determine how sustainable products, processes and behaviours are within the fashion and textile industry. So this is where Anne and I are coming from within our research at the moment. And we're going to be guiding you today through a number of different steps. And we're very much seeing today's webinar as the start of a journey of seminars in collaboration with Green Story. So we are seeing today as an overview, a bigger picture around communicating sustainability. And we're going to be diving into some nuanced topics in the future. So watch this space for that as well. So we're going to start today by talking around the bigger picture. So framing sustainability, as Anne said, in the context of that bigger global fashion system, very much from a multi-stakeholder perspective. We're also going to spend a little bit of time around understanding the core principles of responsible communication within a regulatory and theoretical framework. So very much from the industry, but also from the academic side of things as well. We're going to be looking at showcasing some best practice, some best and worst case practice. So drawing on some examples that can begin to enliven some of the theoretical perspectives that we've discussed. And then we're going to be throwing out a couple of questions to you, the audience, and obviously allowing for some time for some questions and answers towards the end. So as I said, we're going to kick off today with framing this in a much bigger picture. I know everybody's on a very different journey within sustainability, and we kind of wanted to draw it back to the very basics of what are sustainability principles and how does it apply to the global fashion and textile industry. And I think beyond the sector parameters, I think these three things are really begin to frame why we are at a planetary crisis and why we need to really start to take action through our work, through our research, through our applied industry expertise. So our first one is obviously climate change. I think the data is demonstrating that this is evident and it's increasingly becoming urgent in terms of our response to climate change, regardless of the sector that we actually sit within. We know that this is dramatically affecting nature and biodiversity loss. Can't speak today, not good for a seminar. But we know there are interrelationships between these two concepts exist and are becoming ever pressing and of increasing urgency. And we know that this is predominantly down to a huge amount of pollution and waste. And I think especially when we start to think about this within a fashion context, that actual pollution and waste generated from the processes and the products generated, but also the products consumed and disposed of as well. This is a major issue when we start to bring this to the forefront of our discussions within fashion and textiles. So to kind of dig a little bit deeper into that, and again, we position the life cycle of the fashion industry in a circular diagram here, and we'll talk a little bit more around that in a few moments' time. But I think if we begin to look a little bit deeper into the value chain, we go from that kind of design and ideation phase into kind of material choice and material selection, through into manufacturing, through distribution, taking that from a commodity into a saleable, retailable item. And then we enter into the consumer use space. So we begin to discuss elements that are coming up within consumer use and maintenance and care of garments, and then eventually towards the end of life. So when we talk about the value chain, it encompasses all of these stages within that product life cycle. So when we start to think a little bit deeper about what are the impacts created here, and again, there are a huge amount of reports and data and academic literature that really begins to flesh out exactly where within this value chain these impacts occur. So we just wanted to highlight just a few today. And again, although environmental impact is very dear to our heart, it's not something that we're focusing particularly on today. So some of the key considerations when we talk about environmental impact are obviously climate change emissions. These occur in any kind of transportation of goods or services. They obviously occur heavily within the distribution phase of the product life cycle, but also within any of the multiple processes that occur. So certainly within manufacturing, within a factory setting, certainly within the transportation and logistics, but also heavily within consumer use as well, when we're taking care of those garments, washing them, dry cleaning them, drying them. We also need to think about water consumption. And again, water consumption comes at all aspects and phases within the value chain, from the potential growing of the fibre, if it's a natural fibre, through to the processing and manufacturing of that fibre into a yarn, and then eventually into a textile, through into manufacturing, and again, heavily within the maintenance and consumer use phase as well. Obviously, we've got to think about the energy sources, and that heavily comes within fossil fuels, not only in energy sources, but in fibre production as well, especially when we're talking around synthetics. One of the biggest issues challenging some of the end of life phase within the value chain is non-recyclable mixed fibre fabrics. So a lot of this prevents recyclability at the end of life, and is increasingly becoming a focus through academic and industry action in terms of designing for end of life and being able to actually overcome some of these challenges within the end of life phase with mixed fibre materials. And we've got to think about pesticide pollution, obviously within the early stages of material sourcing, and microfiber release as well. So this isn't recognised as an impact category at the moment, but again, coming back to our own research team, this is a heavy focus of our work. So this is an overlooked pollutant within the fashion industry, and as I said, very much overlooked in terms of impact categories when we think about environmental impact. But then we've focused mainly on environmental impact, but it's not to be the only focus, and we need to acknowledge the social impacts within this value chain as well. So again, we could do a whole seminar on environmental impact, but these are some of the key considerations that are coming up within industry and academic reports at the moment. So as I mentioned earlier, a move and a shift towards the circular system and a circular way of working is very much a focus for fashion and textiles. However, it has actually been questioned whether a true move towards circularity is at all possible. So we currently operate in what we call the linear economy, so the linear way of producing and making and consuming goods. So it's this very much a take, make, waste kind of scenario. And then what we see at the moment is that a huge amount of efforts are framed as circular, but actually what all these mechanisms are implementing is a delay to landfill. So it's a take, make, reuse and waste system. So whilst we're embedding some of these more cyclical kind of actions, actually that product is eventually ending up as a waste product. But what we're actually trying to shift towards is this continuous circular action where we take, make and we reuse. So we retain the value of materials and products for as long as possible towards an infinite kind of approach towards circularity. So whenever we talk or see circularity communicated, we really do need to question whether this is just a recycling economy or actually is it truly circular. And I think whenever we have these debates, it comes up around whose responsibility this movement and this action towards circularity is. So is it the producers? Is it the consumers? Should we be producing less? Should we be consuming less? I think from our perspective, and I'm sure Anne will pick up on this a little later, but I think all stakeholders within the value chain have a responsibility, and it is about us all playing our critical role to driving forward towards circularity. So we just wanted to touch on the Fashion Climate Action Charter, and this was a fallout from COP26, and it was a call for fashion to be brought in line with the 1.5 degree pathway in the Paris Climate Agreement. So again, it's touching on that, one of those planetary considerations that we talked about right at the beginning of the presentation. And this was, again, we've just put a little quote on from Web in Vogue Business here, but the fashion industry will only achieve its sustainability targets if brands dedicate communications to making sustainable lifestyles desirable. So what the point we're making here is that bridge between actually how we begin to action this directive towards sustainability and the critical role that sustainability communication really plays in this. So it's about that effective communication across stakeholders, but also the fact that messaging is true and accurate and factual. And again, that's something Anne will be talking at depth in just a few minutes' time. So again, we just wanted to talk a little around framing sustainability, and again, taking this whole product lifecycle approach into consideration. So we've boiled this down, and it's really an extensive amount of literature and reports and kind of knowledge that we're trying to communicate in a very short period of time here. But we've boiled it down into 4 key points. So that is frame, focus, shift, and communicate. So within frame, we're talking about framing leading to different interpretations and reactions from different audiences. And again, audiences is really critical in sustainable communication, and is something we'll touch upon a little later. But it also requires focus, so focus on a positive outcome or an emphasis on the urgent need for significant action affecting stakeholder engagement. So again, you're starting to get the sense here that we're not kind of acting on this alone, but actually that we're bringing together this much bigger narrative across stakeholders and acknowledging that much bigger global agenda. We're talking about shift, so a narration of the fashion industry to sustainable practice and behaviours where a new fashion narrative is the driver of systemic change. So again, we're starting to really focus on the criticality of effective and accurate sustainable communication. And that leads us on to the final point, which is communicate. So to encourage sustainable behaviours and values applied to all aspects of communication, from product level messaging to brand campaigns. So hopefully you've got a sense so far of the urgency and the agenda around framing sustainability, but actually how this critical engagement with stakeholders and effective communication really is the key to creating that meaningful engagement and that meaningful action going forward. But I'm going to hand over to Anne to talk to you much more around communicating sustainability.
Thanks, Alana. So here you see a sort of an accessible diagram showing really what I call the 3 C's of communicating sustainability. And before I go into it, I just want to say that communication essentially is about getting the right message across to the right people in the right way for the sort of best way of basically impacting the situation, and that really is a way to get meaningful change done, and it's critical for our survival in the 21st century in terms of the future of the people, the planet, and also obviously our business interests. And so we need to sort of share information, responsible information, with our stakeholders, our clients, our customers, to achieve our corporate goals in the most pragmatic way. So here we can see then that communication can be this driving force in fashion's climate response. And it's all about demonstrating our dedicated commitment. We've already shown the sort of the sign up of the industry to the Fashion Charter in 2021, and it's sort of now sort of basically walking the talk, that we would turn to sort of looking at the sort of the ways of communicating sustainability. As fashion communicators, fashion sustainable communicators, we are facilitators or engineers of social, cultural, and economic change, effectively to cause this systemic transformation of the fashion industry's value chain operations that will impact on design, production, retail, and product usage, everything that we're involved in across that supply chain. And it's very much about authentic messages, which is back to this little sort of 3Cs formula based on accuracy and transparency. So we've got this idea of coherence and consistency, ensuring that the information and our messaging across everything we sort of communicate as an organization or a brand, and particularly around the sort of the key messaging of sustainability, is clear. It's written in clear language. It's accurate. It conveys meaning in a very sort of simple way. And in doing that, it enhances audience connections and it builds trust, which is critically important. We also need clarity. We need to use fact-based messages, clear language that is very accurate, that conveys meaning, okay, that is substantiated. And again, this is really important, again, to sort of get that across, that our consistency in our messaging, there should be consistency in tone and style that also will create a recognizable brand image at the end of the day. And all this will come together to create a very convincing, sort of powerful way of communicating with our stakeholders. The stakeholders, whether they're suppliers or whether they're customers or whether they're policymakers, will find us credible, that will be based on this clear, persuasive narrative, using very carefully chosen keywords that are sort of devised into messages that make sense of sustainable fashion in the most clear, verifiable way for all of our audiences and all the people that we work with. And undoubtedly, as I've said before, this is a very powerful tool. It really does help drive both internal change within our organizations and externally with all the stakeholders that we deal with. It generates stakeholder interest, and more than that, it creates stakeholder involvement. So there's a co-creational aspect to this, because this is a sustainability journey. And I will keep stressing this as a metaphor in a sense, because I feel this is very important to understand that nobody gets this perfect. And when we set out on a journey, we don't know what we're going to find, but we can map it out carefully, and we know where we want to go. So we have to be always mindful of the fact that the journey evolves, it's dynamic, but it's a journey that we will be approaching in a very positive way through our communications efforts. And this undoubtedly will be a very competitive approach and a strategic approach that will secure our organisation's future in a very responsible way. Okay, next slide. So in terms of how we get started on all this, the best way forward is to immerse ourselves fully in our situation, to totally monitor and understand the landscape in which we're working, and also our competitors and what they're doing, but really largely to understand where we are as an organisation, to understand the sort of sustainability landscape. We know that sustainability is fully embedded across all of our business agendas. It's basically, it's recognised now as a critical business role to build a fair and sustainable role, and we all play a part in that as organisations and brands. So we need these well-crafted sort of communications as a power tool to engage our stakeholders, and that's what we can see in our boxes here on the right hand of the slide. We can see that according to sort of collated research from sources such as McKinsey, and Deloitte that products marketed as sustainable in the past 5 years grew 5.6 times faster. We also know that in terms of our brand image for our organization, whatever that organization is in terms of where it's located across the sort of fashion and textile supply chain, 77% of respondents preferred environmentally responsible products. So we're seeing this sort of predisposition towards that. In terms of recruitment and retention, so this is something that's often overlooked, which is I would call the internal sort of considerations for behaving and operating in a sustainable way as an organization. But 65% of people are more likely to work for a company with strong environmental policies. And I can absolutely assure in the next 5 to 10 years that will grow significantly because of the demographics, the younger demographics who are much more sustainability focused and facing. Then, of course, we know it attracts investment. A sustainability agenda basically guides investment decisions at portfolio level. It's just a given in those terms now from a financial sort of perspective. And then finally, consumers. This varies in terms of what we find, but certainly we're seeing a third to maybe even up to a half of consumers now in certain demographic segments are buying brands that they believe are doing social or environmental good things, and that's very important. And of course that is a broad brief, but that ranges from, I guess, brands demonstrating their sort of fair trade credentials to brands that are sort of basically taking their consumer every step of the way across the supply chain using product passports. Next slide, please. So we basically have to approach this in a staged way, and I did say this was a journey, and in doing that, I think this as a brand, as an organization, if we approach it as a journey, we can stage our progress and we can sort of check our progress as we go, and be mindful again that we are going to evolve and get better at sort of developing and rolling out these stages across our sustainability journey across the years looking forwards. So again, we want these convincing, factual and relatable messages. We want to impact on behaviours and practice, which is really quite important. And if we just look alone at sort of something that Alana talked about earlier, the notion of a circular economy, shifting from linear to circular business models undoubtedly will enable us to maximize product use and sort of extend product lifetimes. So again, we could focus on these tangible sort of actions that we're taking. We obviously at the same time want to then recalibrate sociocultural values, and so changing values again right from sort of suppliers through to consumers is really important, and sort of changing the way we live our lives and sort of encouraging more sustainable practices. In other words, reimagining values and presenting those to consumers, for example, in very engaging storytelling in our sort of brand messaging. Ultimately, to enable advocacy, to sort of motivate and mobilize our consumers to sort of to change their lifestyles and to put action on others who aren't doing, and also obviously to enable and to encourage ourselves, our employees, and our competitors, even who we probably align with in sort of multi-stakeholder associations, to create dialogue with leaders and policymakers. So this is our stage. Stage one, we prepare our sustainability journey, we create transparent messages, we communicate those clearly and effectively using the right channels, and then obviously we evaluate our impact. I would also suggest, and this is probably for another webinar, that this evaluation process has to take place also at every stage, so that we're constantly creating checks and balances on what we do to enable us to ensure that we are on the right track, and to learn as we go, and to learn from our mistakes often as well. Okay, next slide, please. So we need to identify an action framework to develop and apply environmental messages in preparation for near future policy and legislation that will basically certainly mandate sustainable practices across the supply chain, given the fact we've got new reporting regulations, we've got declining consumer trust, and we've got closer investment scrutiny. So we've got to basically master those regulations, meet those growing sustainability reporting requirements in response to voluntary rules and guidelines from governments and regulators. There's, for example, been a 25% increase in green CSR reporting across the last 5 to 8 years globally. Then we've got to be reputation focused. Reputation is critical to every brand, how basically others see us, how all of our stakeholders see us, what's basically said about us when we're not in the room. And here we've got to basically meet growing sustainability reporting requirements in response to this is here again, building on from those voluntary sustainability reporting requirements. We've got to proactively manage customer perceptions, stakeholder perceptions. If we think that 81% of customers say companies should support the environment, and 88% of millennials think that brands should do more good and less bad, then that reputation has to really be at the center of what we're focusing on, building our reputation proactively, managing stakeholder perceptions of us, and how we are seen by others. And then we've got to meet those evolving expectations. We've got to demonstrate that sort of response to environmental and social risks, and really sort of be aware of that. And again, get sort of research again would suggest that 60% of investment board members basically tend to align with companies who are more sustainable and divest from companies with poor sustainability performance. So that's on that sort of criteria judging scenario from the financial community. So that's really quite important. Next slide, please. So we've got these sort of 3 steps to implementation to sort of show where we are. So laying those foundations for our sustainability journey, that focusing on and collating and investing time and effort into generating authentic science-based, credible and trusted information about our organizational activities and operations. We've got to research, and be aware of what is going on in the regulatory environment and understand what our stakeholders want of us. And we can only do that through networking and listening, which is a keystone of good communication. We've got to basically then compare sustainability positioning. Where are we positioned in relationship to our competitors? And can we aim towards some sort of pre-competitive space through our multi-stakeholder sort of professional associations that we can, discuss, learn from others and make things better and collaborate. And then we should sort of connect with people and enforce those core messages, basically, which is very important. And that might come out of that multi-stakeholder sort of partnerships with other organizations and with our professional associations. Stage 2, think about what you're going to communicate. This is, again, back to the storytelling, crafting the narrative. Everything we ever do as a person in business is a story, whether we're writing emails or corporate reports or annual reports. But certainly when we come to sort of telling our sustainability story, which may also be told across all of our corporate narratives and all of our corporate outputs, we have to make sure that it has that consistency of sustainability that is substantiated, and we should obviously ensure that we don't downplay information that isn't as important as we think. So we have to be very clear about that and ensure there's fair and meaningful comparisons in everything that we communicate. And again, this has got to be across the full life cycle of the products. And I did say that earlier that product passports are a great way of communicating to your stakeholders exactly what happens at each stage of your product life cycle. And finally, it's about communicating, identifying communication objectives. What are you really trying to do? What are you really trying to say about your sustainability efforts? And you can't, sustainability, has to be broken down. You can't be, this may be a staged journey of sustainability. You've got to locate and access your key audience. Again, think about which of your audiences need certain information above others. Obviously, a less specialist audience, such maybe consumers, will need a sort of more sort of simple, accessible way of communicating, and then devise your communication and obviously locate the sort of relevant communication channels. So these are the sort of very staged way that we can come back to and flesh out in a moment. Next slide, please. So we know that ultimately, if we look at why this is all necessary and where we are with the situation, we know that misinformation and greenwashing are everywhere. It is a big challenge. This is from the brand perspective. So we are really thinking about how are we currently communicating what we're doing in sustainability terms. Are we doing this correctly? Well, we know also that there are a lot of vague, inflated claims out there by sort of brands and organizations in marketing messages, on packaging, on labels. And it is it's quite a challenge, and it can be quite stressful in many ways. And in 2020, the European Commission found that 53.3% of environmental claims communicated in the EU was vague, misleading, and unfounded. So it wasn't complying with things that we've already advised you to do. Again, the Changing Markets Foundation also issued a report in 2021 about the fashion industry, and finding that 60% of claims by European fashion brands were unsubstantiated. So this leaves a lot of room for improvement in terms of how we are communicating in our sustainability efforts. But at the same time, you can see it from the other side, looking at from our stakeholders and our consumers, that this is a very confusing landscape, and there's a growing mistrust from that basis in terms of what to believe, in terms of what is being communicated by fashion brands. So in response to this, the pressure has been put on. Regulators are creating guidelines and investigating claims and taking enforcement action. So we need, again, evidence and transparency in our communication as brands around our sustainability actions and efforts. Next slide, please. So in response to this, we've seen that the UK Green Claims Code has come out, and the EU have a sort of a parallel initiative. So we have to be sort of very mindful of what's going on there and what to do and what not to do. So fundamentally, these are sort of, I guess, codes at the moment that are not full-blown legislation, but they're sort of they basically are things we should be taking note of and being aware of what they are saying to us, so that we can actually sort of respond and prepare for them, and essentially provide information that when we are communicating across our marketing efforts, that validates claims that are very accessible for our customers, and we don't hide anything, and we're going to be validating our claims and really aligning with this framework to measure progress and to share that across things. So we really want to make sure that we're not sort of using vague language that's too broad and too vague, and that we really are sort of very sort of clear about what we're saying. And that, for example, some products, may contain as little as 20% of recycled fabric when they're claiming to be sort of fully recycled, based on recycled materials. So again, it's about using don't use unsubstantiated generic wording on marketing labels. And this is what the Green Claims Code advises you not to do. And don't make claims based on your ambition and what you're going to do in the sustainability terms without having the proof that you're doing it. And, don't sort of, for example, devise claims that include your scope 3 emissions without information from your external suppliers that you've already validated in terms of their sourcing and their production efforts. Next slide, please. So, as I said earlier, the Green Claims Code that is has been enacted by or devised, sorry, should I say, because it's not yet legislation, but it's been devised by the Competition and Markets Authority on behalf of the UK government, as an example, has put out their checklist that is really useful to look at to ensure that that things are done in the right way by brands. In earlier in 2019 to 2022, the CMA, the Competition Markets Authority, and using the Green Claims Code, called out a number of organisations, fashion organisations, claiming that they weren't aligning with their code, that they weren't offering clear and accurate information to their consumers, that they weren't providing credible evidence, and that they were sort of lacking very much in the way that they were communicating about their sustainable efforts. So, and here we could see one of those was ASOS and their responsible edit campaign 2019 to 2022. This essentially, from the brand's perspective, offered customers to filter products and to find products to buy that were recycled or use sustainable materials, and highlighted that obviously as a value proposition. And new products, obviously, with these types of fast fashion brands, are always edited daily. So this was a very sort of this is a high generation sort of product scenario. Of course, the criticism that came through from the CMA and using the Green Claims Code was that this particular campaign was showed evidence of greenwashing, and claims that were unsubstantiated. It created the idea that clothing collections were more environmentally friendly than they actually were, because in citing or highlighting materials and collections that were and items from those collections that were sustainable, often that were from other brands, they gave no absolute proof, and they sort of as an organization didn't have any verifiable proof, and just went on the basis of what the brands who were advertising on their platform were claiming. So in the end, the Responsible Edit website was removed in June 2022 ahead of this larger investigation into potential greenwashing, and clearly this went all across both social media and traditional media, and there was a lot of sort of negative sort of feedback on this. And clearly this again is a really good example of what to avoid in terms of a fashion brand's trying to sort of develop trust, and also of course develop its sort of brand in a positive way. So this was a very sort of negative experience, and one that clearly ASOS as a brand learned from, and hopefully wouldn't repeat. But again, it's a good example, and I think this is why CMA and the Green Claims Code in its use of, are trying to use this in a very positive way to sort of basically, I guess, educate brands in terms of what not to do and what to do in terms of their sustainable communicative efforts. Next slide, please. So this, I guess, would be more of a sort of a positive example of the H&M Go Green, Wear Blue. This was launched in 2014, and this was a campaign of conscious denim created from recycled waste materials, and its aims were to minimize energy and water usage. It was a sort of a clever, creative campaign with a central creative concept referring to the deep indigo tones of jeans and streetwear collection, and a twist on the word of wearing blue denim but going green. And not very simple, very straightforward, definitely wasn't called out, it used technology and collaborated with Spanish denim consultants Genealogia. Again, maybe a good reminder that sometimes when we are communicating our sustainability narratives, simple and is probably best and more effective, and ultimately is it has to be sort of verifiable. And in this case, everything was proven in terms of the use of recycled waste materials and the type of sustainability that was behind this campaign that was effective. Next slide, please. And another sort of take on sustainability, and again highlighting the fact that sustainability narratives are, sort of endless, in a sense that there's not just one best way to claim to be sustainable. There's not just one best way to be sustainable. So this was a brand, Spanish fashion brand, Adolfo Dominguez, that was basically focusing on longevity and durability, but longevity, buying clothes that last longer than trends. Again, this was a really interesting campaign that very much encouraged consumers to collaborate and almost co-create the campaign, which is again something that is very sort of useful to do, I feel, in our sort of when we are communicating our sustainability efforts and involving our stakeholders in that process, particularly consumers. And this brand asked consumers to return between 20 and 40-year-old clothes that then featured in a campaign online, sort of featuring the sort of subject focus being the sort of the timeless, durable clothing that they have produced, that people were still wearing and were still sort of, sort of treasuring, I guess, in their wardrobe. And of course, this is something that we see coming through in terms of the content of some sustainability campaigns, and certainly outdoor brands, outdoor wear brands, have also gone down this route, and we can think of Patagonia and the whole sort of movement now towards repair and sort of towards treasuring and getting sort of consumers to look in their wardrobes and to identify items of clothing that they have kept and they're still wearing, and possibly repairing to extend their lives. And this whole new way of sort of changing sustainability mindsets and sort of lifestyles that I talked about at the beginning, in terms of enabling all stakeholders and specifically consumers to sort of reimagine the values that they have in terms of the sort of the fashion that they buy and they own and they sort of use on a daily basis. Next slide, please. So we also know, and this is sort of really interesting as well, in a very generic way, if we collate all the research that's done around who consumers are, they tend to divide into two basic groups, or most simply, the specialists who have a very core interest in sustainability. They look for great detail on sort of into companies' sustainability strategies and messaging and goals and performances, in terms of everything they say and do across their marketing efforts. And they know the industry well, the fashion industry, and specific topics in detail. They'll have a very good understanding of sort of sort of what sort of circularity means, as an example, or they may be very sort of clear about the science behind sort of environmental impact assessments of fashion products and across the supply chain. Then we'll have the generalists who have more of a surface interest in sustainability. They might make very quick, speedy judgments on company efforts and don't really care much about details. They may look at basically fundamentally what the company's saying, maybe in their advertising or on their social media campaigns or on their labels and packaging, and maybe just look for keywords such as sort of eco or recycled, and there'll be, I mean, there will be a hybridity between those two groups, but that's sort of a guiding force. But to start with, initially, when you're sort of trying to understand who is my consumer or who is my stakeholder, and where are they coming from in terms of sustainability. So again, this might lead us as sustainable fashion communicators onto a set of key questions in terms of what do we want people to know, our stakeholders that we are involved with, what information do we want to share with them, what messages do we want to convey, and typically we would identify 3 to 4 key messages initially. What do we want people to feel and relate to in terms of our sustainability? What will they be more inclined to do? We often find, for example, that more human-facing stories around sustainability are more relatable. Around maybe the sort of the people who've made the garments, with a sort of a fair trade messaging or source as an example. What do you want people to do and act on beyond that, from that? What do you want your consumers and customers to do? And again, how do you direct them beyond, post-purchase as in that regard, in terms of care of the garments, as an example? And what actions are you asking them to take coming out of your communications? You are sort of directing them, but you're also inviting them, as we can see. That's entirely possible, to invite them into a working relationship with you, as we could see, with some of the organizations we talked about. And certainly if you look at a company such as Patagonia, that's certainly what they are doing, and wanting more involvement from their sort of consumers, in terms of the garments they wear, the garments they have, what they do with them, and how we can extend their lives, if indeed they need that. So this is something that's sort of important for you to sort of think about, but this is a nice checklist emerging from this understanding of and profiling your stakeholders and customers. Next slide, please. So as a sort of a summary of all of that, what we're really looking for at the end of the day is, truthful, accurate, science-based and factual information that's clear and unambiguous, that avoids, hiding or downplaying important information, that uses very meaningful comparisons and connections. So, the use of sort of metaphors and explanations around, what you're trying to do and what that feels like or what that is like. And obviously the other aspect that I hadn't mentioned here is that also is that crops up in those Green's Claims codes, is that it's not just about words, it's also about graphics and images, and sort of thinking about the use of that. So don't again, the use of the color green or the use of natural sort of scenery can actually sort of be considered to be misleading if you can't substantiate the fact that your garment sort of your textile production is as sustainable as you are claiming. And again, consider the full life cycle of the product or service. And again, this might be a situation where you, as a brand or an organization, decide to have a sustainability story around a certain aspect of that sort of life cycle. That might be in sort of your, the sort of production of your textiles, the type of textiles that you are producing, or it might be more focused on consumers and post-consumption care. So that's important. It needn't be all of it, and it can't be all of it. So I think identify which part of that life cycle, production life cycle, that you'll be focusing on. But largely and always, it's got to be substantiated and grounded messaging, claims that are supported by strong evidence. And as we can see, the Green Claims codes in both Europe and the UK at the moment are very clear about this. And of course, this is not just to talk about Europe, as the only place this is happening. I know across Asia and in the North America, we also have similar sort of pre-regulatory pre-legislative and regulatory initiatives taking place. So there's no doubt that at some point in the sort of not too far future, all of this will become legislation and not just be an optional choice to risk, as it were. So at the end of the day, there's no doubt that substantiated and grounded messaging, what you say about what you're doing to your consumer, can only develop the best sort of relationship, and a relationship that will have its own longevity. So that's very important. Next slide, please. Okay, so we have sort of reached, talking about longevity, we've reached the end of our presentation here. And we would love to have some feedback or generate some questions that we could answer. I think we have a sort of maybe 8 minutes or so to do that. So maybe we could open that up to the chat. Alana and myself are happy to field any questions. We would in truth, be very interested to find out what your needs are as an organization or a brand or a stakeholder in all of this. What are your sustainability communication challenges and needs? Just to throw it out there as the start of a discussion, perhaps.
We can give the audience maybe a couple of minutes to put their questions together. But in the meantime, and Alana, I do have a question that's come up from one of my team, actually, when we were looking through when you were going through the presentation, and that was about the digital product passport. So you mentioned that it is important and a great vehicle for talking about sustainability. What do you think about the utility of it, though? Like when you look at DPPs, as they're called, there is like one extra step needed in terms of scanning it. And do you think there will be an effective vehicle for getting the claims across, or what could be done better for digital product passports?
I think it's not the only way, but it's one way that we have at the moment. And I agree. I mean, as communicators, we're always aware of trying to remove any barriers to communication, and obviously technology barriers, because that is not the most inclusive way of communicating. I think it's got to be personally, it's got to be an omni-channel approach to our communications. And we haven't really covered, that's the next stage on, where we'll be talking about, how to communicate your message, which channels to choose and why. And I just sort of touched on that. So for me, it would be omni-channel. It's almost like if you were developing and communicating your message, I think around sustainability and what you are doing, I think it's got to be more considered. It can't just rely on one thing. So again, you couldn't just rely, even if you were focusing on social media, you don't just rely on an Instagram campaign, for example, or it's got to be more fully rounded. But I do acknowledge, yes, we're not there with the technology, and there's a long way to go. And plus, it is obviously resource intensive. I don't know if Alana has any thoughts around it.
Yeah, I mean, I think engagement is always going to be difficult. And I think there's an argument for potentially too much information being made available as well. Whilst we're striving for traceability and transparency, especially with the DPP, I think that messaging, and especially when we frame this within communication, I think there is a level of too much information as well. And it has been proven, especially within academic literature, that a lot of audiences shut down as soon as there is too much information. So I think it's finding the balance, and it's finding the appropriate information for the appropriate audiences, especially when it's optional communication. Obviously, if it's regulatory or necessary, then that's a different matter. But I think it's finding that right type of engagement, the right channel, as Anne was saying, but the right quantity of information as well.
That's actually a really great point. And funnily enough, Anne, it links back to a presentation you did with us about a year ago.
Yes.
And we had John from PACT echo a very similar thought on, I think he called it breadcrumbs, or just giving the right information at the right time. Do you have any insights on that from both of you, as to what are some of the best case examples where, when it comes to sustainability communication, what are some of the practices to follow in giving the right information at the right time, and what kind? It's fairly new field, I'm assuming, but it would be great to get your insights on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's about understanding your audience, isn't it? I mean, and your consumer sort of demographic. And I think it's, again, back to the journey metaphor and the touch points at which you'll be communicating with that consumer. I agree, simple. I think, as we've said already, simple is effective. And it's about sort of, you can't sort of lose if you set out in a very strategic way, to identify what you're trying to do, what are your basic sort of 3 maybe key messages, and weave those around your story and get those out across different touch points. I think that will connect with your consumer. I don't think you can lose on that, but keep it simple, not try to be too sort of complicated, and not, as I guess as Lauren said, not try to over egg the pudding and you push out too much information, for sure. So yeah, that would be my, keep it simple really, but keep it structured and keep it strategic, and sort of, keep your messaging very sort of specific. Okay, three key core messages I would start with at the end of the day. So that would be, what I would do. And we do see brands doing that. We do see, and obviously, the leaders in this, we've already talked about Patagonia, who are very sort of good at that and have built their reputation on the basis of that. And the brands that are sort of strong, Ganni is another one, another fashion brand that I love, because they also acknowledge that we can't be sustainable in every way, and that it is a journey, and ultimately nobody's a sustainable brand if we're being called to question. So just explaining which part of sustainability you're focusing on, what is your sustainability story, and that would be the approach, not to be over ambitious and not to communicate your vision as opposed to what you're actually doing now and what can be done.
And I think that just following on from that, Anne, I think that comes on to the question in the chat, actually, because Alex has asked a question around greenhushing, and
yeah,
absolutely the tail end of your discussion there was definitely around that. And I think, greenhushing is nothing new. Research that I was doing 15 years ago with brands was around them being absolutely terrified to communicate their sustainability message for the fear of being caught out. But I think it comes back to those real kind of securities, I guess, that we talked about during the presentation. And it's about having the confidence as a brand to be able to communicate and really be assured in the messaging that you're putting out. So actually, is it based on fact? Can you verify it and substantiate it? So I think it's going back to those real key principles of the Green Claims Code and the Green Claims Directive. So I think greenhushing, especially if it's authentic and that kind of action and that messaging is authentic, then I think it's a great shame. But I think if a brand is really confident in the messaging and their actions, then they should be confident in communicating that as well. But a great question, Alex. Thank you.
No, a really good question, and I totally agree. And I think it's also a reflection of the sort of the call-out society in which we live, perhaps now because of social media, and the everybody's sort of on trial, as it were, for what they say, which is no bad thing, because it means that we really now have to do our homework. And that really is what we're saying in terms of approaching this strategically, and make sure that you invest in time and effort in monitoring what's out there, what you're doing, positioning your own company, but making sure that when you come to sort of devise your communication, your sustainability narratives, you can fully reside on them with full confidence that you're claiming the truth, basically, and that this can only strengthen your brand equity in every way. And we have to have that confidence, so you're not feeling that if you want, you go into this by thinking, if I am going to be judged, I can absolutely sort of support myself with verifiable science-based evidence that what we are doing in our sustainability effort is 100% true. As far as it can be, but as that's very important, because obviously we want to avoid damaged brand reputation, and so it's sort of interesting that that's sort of happened almost as a reaction. But my feeling is it can only enable us to find the middle ground of where we really should be communicating as an organisation on sort of fully verifiable evidence.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And Alana, it's a great question to end on. Basically, great data leads to greater confidence. And
absolutely.
we're looking forward very much to continuing this series. This is always so insightful every time I speak with the two of you. So it's great to have you on board, having this webinar and quite a few more to come. But once again, thank you both for hosting this, and thank you to everybody who attended. And until next time, and do watch out for any clips we'll be putting out on YouTube. You can feel free to reach out to Anne and Alana. The emails are provided here. You can reach out to me. It's akhil@greenstory.io, but I'm assuming if you're attending the webinar, you know that already. So let's catch you until next time, and thank you again to our presenters.
Thank you.
Thank you. Great to see you all.
Yes, thank you. Thanks to everybody.